Hello, everyone. Nice of everyone to join. Also, thank you, Konrad, again for joining. So in today's Phi Talk, we will have Professor Konrad Schindler from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, or ETH, who is a professor there in photogrammetry and remote sensing, to give a presentation about AI models for 3D point clouds. And Konrad is also a visiting professor to Phi-Lab, so we have a connection in that sense. Yeah, and with that, I will leave the word to Konrad. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me well? Is the mic working well? Good. Okay. So thank you for the invitation. Great to be back at the Phi-Lab, even if only virtually. And for today's talk, we have somehow agreed on this title of Foundational AI Models for 3D Point Clouds, or at least how we are hoping to get there. So the idea is that we want to build generalist learning schemes that are able to handle this natively 3D data. So I guess it is not surprising, but 3D point clouds are everywhere. They are used in all sorts of domains. You have seen the ones that are built onto the roofs of autonomous cars or taxis. They're used obviously in the whole construction and city modeling industry as a standard tool for 3D surveying. They're even built into your phone, by the way, 3D sensors. For dynamic scenes, people build big setups where you can still make this happen by recording with high frequency. So 3D is just a, say, native sensing modality nowadays. And I want to emphasize that the word native, this is not only about 3D from images. It can come from multiple viewpoints or different ways from images. But then there is, of course, the argument being peddled that, well, but if you start from an image, why would you actually make a 3D model? Just make a 2D model and let the thing internally in its latent wisdom figure out what it needs to know in 3D. But that is not the point. The point is that the sensing that we are using is natively 3D. And therefore, we have this data. There's a reason why the sensor records it that way, usually with the runtime of some electromagnetic signal. And we want to make sense of that data. And importantly, for the context of the Phi-Lab, this data is also everywhere in Earth observation. So it is the standard tool nowadays for making geometric models, for making elevation models, at least whenever the elevation is complicated. So again, out in the flat land, we can solve everything with stereo triangulation, or there's interferometry and all sorts of things. But when it really comes to city models in densely built up environments where you have visibility problems, where you have a lot of discontinuities and sharp jumps, then people use LiDAR. When it comes to forestry, where you have this volumetric scattering behavior, so we want to see through the trees, we want to see the vertical profile, the vertical structure of the vegetation, not just the top layer, then people use LiDAR. So also in the domain of Earth observation, at least reasonably close range Earth observation for ESA standards, point clouds are everywhere, are used as a standard representation, as a standard measurement process. There are also some that are taken from space, by the way, but those are, of course, usually very sparse, simply because of the distance. And while they are used in many domains, today I'm going to focus in terms of application on this running example of forest ecology, forest economy, forest management. So it's the idea of basically measuring trees. As I said, especially when it comes to vegetation and trees, point cloud sensing, LiDAR scanning, active sensing has become sort of the tool of choice, simply because we can look through some layers of the trees and get density information, get health information out of it, see the ground below the trees. And yeah, this concerns, of course, ecology. We want to know how our forests are doing, how to keep them healthy, how to preserve the ecosystem. It also has an economic dimension. On the one hand, there is the forest as a source of wood, as a place that has a recreational value and so on. Then there's also what they call tree crops. So there is a sort of forest that is actually planted by people to harvest fruits that grow on trees. So LiDAR sensors go in the forest, and the idea is to automate what people in forestry and forest ecology have been doing by hand so far, and therefore to scale it up. So here on the left, this is the caricature of the traditional way of measuring parameters of trees in the forest. Like here, one of the standard parameters that many of you have certainly heard about is the diameter at breast height. So that's basically what's the diameter of the tree at 1.30 meters above ground, which is correlated, if you know something about the tree species, with the wood volume, even with the height, with the density. You can also go towards biomass and so on. So this is an important parameter. We might want to know the height. We might want to know the crown volumes. We might want to know the stand density. And we want to get this at scale. And as you can imagine, the poor guy here in the forest, although it's a very enjoyable place to work, would have to run around for a very long time to do this for hectares and square kilometers. So we try to automate it with different types of sensors, with airborne sensors on drones or manned airplanes or helicopters or even airships nowadays. Or we do it from the ground, either fixed or mobile in a backpack, or even slightly more exotic, as you see here, this contraption of the robot, the four-legged robot that's carrying the sensor through the forest. And from that sort of data, we want to understand the environment. So understand, again, boils down to a number of tasks that one can formalize as types of data analysis or machine learning. We may want to get the individual trees. So we don't want just a diffuse cloud of points. We want it segmented, compartmentalized into the individual trees whose properties we want to know, which are the entities that we can handle, right? I mean, if a tree is sick, we need to know which one. If we want to harvest the tree, we need to know what comes down if we cut it. So an individual tree obviously makes sense to know. We may want to know the species of the tree. So that is more of a sort of a classification problem. I show you a piece of a point cloud and you tell me what type of tree it is. And then you can also do the semantics. You might want to know what's the wood and what's actually not part of the tree, but just the forest floor and so on, without necessarily splitting it into bits. And you want to access all sorts of parameters. I'd say there are two types of attributes. One of them is mostly geometric, so it can be derived quite easily or reasonably well if we have the individual trees. What's the stem diameter? What's the crown diameter? What's the crown volume? What's the height of the tree? And then there are more physical or qualitative attributes, like what is the wood quality, what is the health of the tree, and these sort of things. By the way, I haven't said it yet, but if there is a question that is pertinent to a particular part of the talk, to a particular slide, just raise your virtual hand or unmute and speak up so that we can handle it right away. That's no problem. Okay, the analysis of data, of perceptual data nowadays is largely done with neural networks, with deep learning or visual AI models, if you want to call it that way. And so at first thought, it's easy, right? There's so much computer vision. There are so mature systems for analyzing, generating, handling images, pixel images, that we can just generalize those and say, well, we'll take what we know from images and do it in 3D instead, and we're done. But unfortunately, there are a few differences. Pixels, and I'm not only talking about image pixels, but regular dense raster data has nice properties for being handled by these models. This doesn't even have to be pixels. As I said, sound is actually often also represented that way. So you have two axes. One is for the wavelength and one is for the amplitude. Altimetry, so if it's in 1D, if you look at waveform analysis from a continuous LiDAR, like from a single LiDAR beam, you could see this as a 1D sort of regularly sampled signal. But all these have in common that they are a regular lattice. They are this raster of regularly spaced, completely sampled pixels. And that is not what you get from 3D. In 3D, the points are irregularly spaced. So the distance between 2 points is not always, two neighboring points is not always the same. In fact, it's not even clear who are the neighbors of a point. It's just a mass of points distributed in space. There's some anisotropy, so depending on the materials and the distances and so on, it actually distance to the sensor, that is, the point-to-point average distance changes as well. We don't know who are the neighbors. The neighborhood somehow has to be established artificially. And what's in one sense particularly different, but also particularly helpful to make things possible, is the extreme sparsity. So most of the 3D space is actually empty. In most of the 3D space, there are no points at all. This is not the case in an image, if you think about it, right? If you think of a satellite image, there might be more or less interesting areas, but there are pixels everywhere. There's not just a big data gap somewhere usually. There are exceptions like clouds. So how do deep networks look that can be used for point cloud analysis? I'm sure that is known by many, but for completeness, I thought I'd have to include it. So the forefather of them all, the earliest attempt, were these PointNet style methods, where one essentially says, well, the points don't have a regular neighborhood. We cannot run a normal convolution filter about it. So what we do is we make a neural network with some learned parameters that we apply only to the parameters of every single point. So its coordinate, maybe some measured intensity or color or whatever we have there. And we learn one set of weights that we apply to every single point in the same way. So if you want, this is an irregular one-by-one convolution, or if you want, it's also just a multi-layer perceptron that has shared weights across all points. And then we have a sort of an abstraction at every single individual point level. And then to get spatial context, we have to do something because we don't have filters that combine in space. So instead, we just do a pooling over some neighborhood, some ball around the point or so, or its n nearest neighbors. And then we pool over this neighborhood. So we take the maximum or the mean or some sort of pooling operation to merge all the descriptors of all those points in there into one. And then we have a new set of features in space, and we can apply the next level of a multi-layer perceptron and so on. So this was the PointNet principle. And it, of course, has certain weaknesses. It's worse at actually preserving the structure and the layout locally of the points. It does a pooling over a neighborhood, but it doesn't remember very well what the relative position is or so. A second version that came later and that was dominant for a while is this sort of voxel-based sparse convolution. So essentially, we divide the 3D space into complete regular little cubes, so-called voxels, just like we do it with the pixels in the image plane. And then we can, of course, really do a direct generalization. We do exactly the same that we do with the discrete images, with the discrete convolution kernels, just in 3D, so the memory explodes a bit. And we then assign those features. If we want, we can even bring them back to the original point clouds by essentially just linearly interpolating within a voxel. And the trick here is to use the sparsity so that one doesn't get a memory explosion. So we implement a custom data structure that only has voxels in those places where there are points, and otherwise there are no voxels and we can just skip them and don't have to compute. And then more recently, of course, following immediately again in the wake of language and vision, people had the idea, well, the new dominant architecture beyond convolution is the transformer. So something that's built on a exhaustive attention within some window on pairwise relations. So you basically need to turn your data into tokens, and then you have a long token stream and you do an exhaustive pairwise attention over them. You learn how to, in a data-driven way, sort of tuned to the data, weigh them relatively to each other so that they're combined and share information. And in the end, when you've done that normally over multiple layers, you have some sort of decoder that turns those tokens back into the raw output. So maybe a class label or a set of class label for every original point or something like that. So that's the general class of point transformers. That was the background. Let's look how it applies to the forest. So each of these was in turn at some point, say, adapted to apply to trees or to scans of trees. PointNet++ was, again, probably the earliest one. And there's this so-called FSCT that where people apply this directly to trees and they use it to segment them. Like here you see an example where the ground and the wood portion and then everything else, which people call the leaf, so which is the non-woody above ground component, are segmented as visualized here by the different colors. This is where actually I entered the game of forest scan analysis together with colleagues from the Norwegian Bioeconomy Institute and with my student Binbin. We worked on doing a similar thing, so adapting essentially the sparse convolution version, this voxel-based continuous sparse convolution, to the realm of point clouds and make feature extractors that can understand the forest point clouds and segment them. In this case here you see, for example, into individual trees from which you can then get some forestry attributes like the dBH and so on. And more recently with transformers, so far it was mostly only halfway. Maybe the most well-known current tool, the state-of-the-art tool for this sort of analysis, is the so-called forest former, which is a hybrid. So the encoder is actually sparse convolution. It's still like in the old Phi-Lab, but on top of that, after having featurized, or if you want, tokenized the forest with the help of convolution, there are transformer layers to model the relations and decode back into what you want. This was still done by Binbin together with Machi, but at the time she was already in Norway, so I can't claim it as my work. So that's where we were. And then I guess so far we've talked about the history of point cloud modeling in the last 8 years or so. And now, of course, we are, if you want, at least some people claim that, in the era of foundation models. So now we want models that are not just specific one-off for a specific task in a specific environment, but we want more generalist models where once and for all we learn sort of a good abstraction of something, of natural images or of proteins, or in our case of forest scans, such that we can apply them in a range of environments and we don't always have to start from scratch, collect lots of data, use heavy compute and so on. And our first attempt to go a bit in that direction was this segment any tree work, which is essentially the same as the Phi-Lab, so this convolutionally based point cloud analysis tool, and trained just for a wide range of data. So we said, the first thing you need if you want to be general is to have a very broad range of training data with different properties so that you don't over-specialize, overfit, as they say, to one. So you want terrestrial scans, you want airborne scans, you want dense scans, you want sparser scans, you want different types of forest, more deciduous, more conifers, more southern, more northern. And we collected actually, Stefano and his team collected lots of point clouds. We also, using another trick, augmented them artificially. Making sparser point clouds from denser ones is relatively easy by just subsampling, so you can simulate a range of densities and still work with sort of semi-real data. And with this, we just retrained the thing and got to a model that was sort of a first baby step towards a foundational model, in that you could give it scans of quite dramatically different density. It could be 500 or 200 points per square meter, or it could be 2000. And nevertheless, it would do a reasonable job at analyzing those data because it had learned to accommodate those different densities. And now, this was good in the sense that it gave us an indication, it gave us some sort of an optimistic pointer that looking for generality is good. It's not just a pain, it's not just more work and larger models and a bigger effort, but you get beyond the convenience of not having to redo your models, you get a gain in terms of performance. So this more varied training data across the board tended to improve the performance. If you want, what this says is that if you add a slightly sparser scanned forest from Switzerland, you are still better at working at analyzing Norwegian densely scanned forest than if you have only densely scanned Norwegian train data. So this additional information, although it is not perfectly matched, seems to help in the sense that just the variability, the richness of patterns is increased, and you will eventually learn some shapes, some layouts that otherwise would have been missed. So there is a benefit from generality if the model is large enough to accommodate all that information, of course. And then having seen that, making it bigger, making it more varied is actually beneficial. It helps every individual task as well. We asked ourselves the natural question, scientifically annoying, but nowadays natural question. Is there also here a scaling behavior? Do we have one of the famous scaling laws? Can we just scale up the data, make the models bigger and more general, and eventually we'll have emergent capabilities that help everybody? So is there a way of just brute forcing it with data and compute in some sense? And then when you're at that question, very naturally, you take the next step and think, what are the ingredients to build such a generalist model? How have the successful examples been generated of such models that have this very broad applicability, can be adapted well to different applications and so on? And I guess the common thread there is, and you can look to computational biology, you can look to general image processing, like the famous Dino series of models. You can, of course, look to language, to BERT and GPT and all the fabulous models that are the forefathers of our modern chatbots. And you can also look to remote sensing, to foundational models there. As a representative here, I have TerraMind from our research colleagues here in IBM Zurich. And what they have in common, first of all, self-supervised pre-training, which means you pre-train them on data sets that are very large, but that don't have labels. You don't need to have ground truth reference annotations, which are usually the bottleneck because they're hard to generate. Just raw data without labels is easy to collect nowadays because of sensor automation. And the second point is all these modern models rely on the power horse of modern data-driven learning, the transformer architecture. Which, yeah, all of you know what a transformer is. It's essentially a neural network which has layers that do this pairwise self-attention or cross-attention, and in between some additional layers, usually essentially multi-layer perceptrons as nonlinearities. And it's not completely clear why that architecture is so good at learning these relations at very large scale, but one can see it as a sort of a general purpose computer, right? You reduce inductive bias, you make fewer assumptions about your data where you say what should be the biases and relations. You leave it very general. You build something that can sort of compute almost anything. If you think about it, a transformer with its attention mechanism, it can combine two numbers and depending on their magnitude, decide whether the output will be large or small. So you can build some soft version of logic gates and so on, and you can do very general computation. And so these two ingredients we felt are probably a good starting point, given the successes in other disciplines. So yeah, the transformer architecture, I guess I don't need to explain it in detail to anybody, but ultimately it is, it's built on this idea that you have exhaustive pairwise attention. So every so-called token, every unit of information talks to every other one. But you can also see it the other way around. It's like a generalization of the convolution or general MLP idea, in that you don't learn a fixed set of weight with which you combine your inputs, but you learn actually to have a weighted combination of your inputs at every layer, but the weights again depend on all the other tokens. So the whole context determines what is a good weighting, what is important in the information. And then, since it is technically a set model, so it's permutation invariant, the order of the token doesn't matter. If you permute the tokens and you permute the attention in the same way, then you get the same output. So somehow we have to preserve the order, in language, the logical sequence, in images, the layout, and in 3D, of course, also the geometric layout. So we explicitly put it in there. This is then called a positional encoding. You find some way of essentially embedding the coordinate within your data stream or within your data volume into every token. So that is the building block on which all of this is built. Okay, having the transformer, and it's really the same transformer principle that is inside all our language models and nowadays also our vision models. How do we adapt it to point clouds? There were multiple attempts. I guess the most well-known and most mature one, or most widespread one, is the point transformer, now in its third version, for a fourth one upcoming, I believe, but PTV3 is maybe the widespread one now. So how do you generalize it? How do you get from text tokens to point tokens? And the first idea is a transformer ultimately always deals with a stream of tokens. They're always serialized. It's a long sequence in every transformer model. The rest is done by the position embedding. So how do you serialize points well into a 1D sequence so that neighborhood relations are at least approximately preserved? You cannot do it exactly, obviously, and completely, but you can do you can try to take the points in a volume and sort of align them in a one-dimensional sequence along a sort of Perl string in a way that a lot of the neighborhood is preserved. And this is done with so-called space-filling curves. So a class of curves in mathematics that they are sort of have the self-similarity and refine themselves, but ultimately they go to everywhere in space. No matter how small you define space, you can have such a curve that goes through everywhere. And if you use these space-filling curves that sort of completely cover the space at a certain step width, this gives you a way of having a more or less locality-preserving 1D arrangement of the 3D points. So that's maybe the most elegant trick of this PTV3, which earlier versions actually didn't have. And then you can do the normal attention, like in a transformer, obviously locally in a certain window. So it's not global over the entire point cloud. That would be infeasible because the attention matrix grows quadratically. But you have a sort of a sliding window along that sequence if you want. So you take local chunks of that sequence and within them compute the attention pairwise between all the points. So you split that sequence up into fixed size chunks and then do the attention within there. And the last question, or the last trick in the point transformer was how do you do the positional encoding in 3D? And there they resolved to saying, well, the relative position, how the things are laid out with respect to each other, is actually something that you can cover well with convolution. So we do a sparse 3D convolution, as it was in the old ConvNets, in the Minkowski engine or 4iNet or whatever. You use sparse convolution layers, and those serve as our relative positional encoding. At least that was the claim. The reality is that a fair bit of the context modeling is done by that convolution too. It's actually not only positional encoding. If you look at the point transformer V3 and you dissect it, which we did at some point, and at the bottom you see the parameter count. And if you look at it, the blue boxes are bigger than the orange boxes. What this means is convolution. These convolution layers, which supposedly are only the positional encoding, actually have more parameters than the entire transformer part. So the point transformer is actually not really a point transformer. It's a point convolution transformer, if you want. And that model, that was sort of or is still among the most mature ways of getting the transformer principle applied to 3D, and has been used in multiple tasks, indoor point clouds, autonomous driving, wherever. Now here again, we, as I already said, started to analyze this point transformer in more detail and see how can we make it more usable. I'm not sure, it could be that Yuan Wen, who did this work, is even present. And we came up with an enhanced version with a next level. We didn't call it PTV4, obviously, because we are not the same people that made the previous point transformers. We called it Light PT. But it is the same idea, just really focusing on the essentials. So discard what is not needed, find out what is really needed to make such a model work. And again, this is not blaming the previous authors. The point transformer V3 is a great piece of work, really admirable. But as so often, when you do a first attempt and you have to try many things, some things work, some things don't, some things you adapt historically, like such a project grows. And then stuff accumulates that is there for historical reasons, but maybe you could do without it. And so we just tried to really push on that front. So we figured out if you leave out the attention part and do only convolution, then the lower levels actually work perfectly well, because there it's mostly local geometric properties between small neighborhoods of points. So you don't need this large range context of the transformer. On the contrary, at the high level where that is needed, you can actually do away with the convolutions, because those local informations are no longer needed and the convolutions are super costly because the filter depth gets deeper and deeper usually. And so we made this reduced version in Light PT that has only convolutions at the low level and only attention blocks at the high level. And of course, we sort of ablated and figured out where's the best way to switch, or do we need an overlap or whatever? Turns out we don't. There's one technical problem remaining. If we remove the convolutions at some point, then we lose the position, right? The positional embedding trick via convolutions is gone as well. And Yuan Wen's idea, which by now has been taken over also by others, including the original point transformer people, was to use a 3D version of the rope, these rotational positional encodings that had originally become popular for language. So essentially, you just do it for the 3 coordinates and append it sort of into one positional encoding. And then you have a fixed parameter-free, hard-coded positional encoding that nevertheless works equally well. And with that, we were able to trim the point transformer. It's still sort of a similar model, just reduced to the essentials. It has a lot less than half, so maybe around a third or so of the parameters. It also has less than half of the computation time, and it works equally well in some situations. It works even slightly better. So this is sort of the, in our view, maybe the almost state of the art of a point transformer model. The takeaway message for you is we now have reasonably mature transformer models for point clouds. So the first ingredient for making a foundation model is there. We have functioning transformers, PTV3 or even Light PT. Here you see these things work fairly well. Use some semantic segmentation results, in this case for indoor data. The middle is the predicted class labels. The right side is the ground truth. Black are unlabeled, so black are essentially data gaps where the ground truth has not been labeled. And if you compare those, you actually really have to search carefully to find mistakes. So you see this works fairly well. Purely from that geometry and color, we can do some semantic understanding at really great detail. In some sense, the prediction is almost better than the ground truth because it didn't leave so many data gaps, and you find really very few mistakes. So these things are working well now. Also outdoors, so this is an autonomous driving example. And of course, to come back to the topic of the talk, also for the forest. So here you have some examples, and Yuan Wen very meticulously labeled with those black circles where there are even differences, because otherwise it takes you a while to see where they are. So yes, of course, there are minor deviations, but by and large, these models, I think, are now really at a state where they are usable, where we can deploy them. So they have the performance that is needed to be practically useful and not just scientifically interesting. Okay, and then the second ingredient towards a foundation, more foundational models, the self-supervised learning. So you have to find a way, a proxy objective. How can you essentially make the model learn something, acquire information, acquire abstraction of the structure within the data without having to label by hand what the correct answers are, without providing ground truth reference data, because you can't do that at arbitrary scale. In theory, the model doesn't have to be self-supervised. If the weights are good and you ship them and people can use them as they are, it's a foundation model. From the user's perspective, it's perfectly okay. But in practice, you usually need self-supervised learning to be able to, to enable the data scaling, to make it possible to use these huge amounts of data where you wouldn't have the resources to get them all labeled. So you have to learn from unlabeled data. You have to find an objective where you somehow trick the model into looking only at the data and having a task where from a part of the data you have to predict another part or something. So you can have this pure reconstruction, masked autoencoding, but the most successful version at the moment is this self-distillation version. So you have two models. One's called the teacher, one's called the student. It's a bit confusing because they are actually not of different size. And one model has an easier task in some sense. It sees a larger context, you give it larger views, you don't perturb them or mess them up. And the other model has a harder job because you give it smaller bits and perturbed bits, so you sort of restrict its information input and make it more complicated. And that model with the harder task tries to learn the parameters. And the model with the easier task is not allowed to learn its own parameters, but its parameters are actually an exponential moving average, if you like, a sort of a smooth average of the versions of the student as it evolves. So you have a sort of you aggregate different versions of the student into the teacher, and then you have a loss that says these two should have a similar behavior. So the two models, which either they see the information cleaner, but they can't adapt directly to it, or the other one, which sees less information, but it learns more actively, it learns faster, they should have the same information. And this teacher-student self-distillation paradigm will eventually lead the models to get features that you can extract from the small bits of the model, but that are also useful for the large one, and the other way around. The probably most famous say instantiation of this model is the Dino image feature series. So Dino, then Dino V2, then now Dino V3. There are other variants that use slightly similar objectives with different names, but by and large, this is how the self-distillation works. So you have a trick to basically say reconstruct the features with two different variants of the model where that have a slightly different complexity, but that are linked together via this exponential moving average function. This principle has been adapted to point clouds by the same people that built the point transformer V3 actually, and it's called Sonata. So it's essentially do Dino with point clouds. So you put a encoder in there, they used PTV3, we did the same with the light PT, of course, and then again give it point clouds that are more global or give it more local views, and have this teacher and student sort of build features that are good for both. And in this way, you have a self-supervised, you let this run with very large amounts of data for as long as you can, or until it converges, which takes a long time. And then you get features that somehow describe the geometric and semantic properties of the data in an abstract way, such that they hopefully capture underlying structures and concepts and patterns. Of course, in an ideal world, those features would be once and for all. You train them once and then they are good for everything. They contain all the important information, And then you just have to put a little head on top, some linear classifier or a small multi-layer perceptron or so, and that would be enough to solve your problem. That's the ideal world and what we all hope for. Dino is actually often used in that way. In practice, I guess ESA people concerned with remote sensing know that well. In practice, it often doesn't quite get there, especially if you're still data constrained and would want more variety. And then those models need a bit of fine-tuning. So, they haven't learned nothing about your task. If you want to segment into individual trees, or if you want to measure the health of a tree, are different things. And the models didn't know in advance. The model during self-supervised training doesn't know that you want to do that. So some information is hopefully preserved that is useful for what you want to do, but it's not perfectly tuned to it. And therefore, some fine-tuning is often needed. So we also have to slightly improve the feature extractor, the encoder itself, rather than freeze it completely. Unfortunately, that's the current state of affairs. We're hoping it goes away, of course, but so far nobody has managed to get rid of that step completely. Okay, and then the last ingredient, we have transformers for point clouds. We have self-supervised learning, where we didn't have to do much, basically adapt in a qualified manner what the imaging people were doing. And now we need data. We have not yet gotten to a point where we have a globally distributed huge data set, but at least we have something that's better than before, which is a large data set. It's diverse forest scans from Europe, especially Northern Europe. They have been collected and put together by Stefano Politi, our colleague from the Norwegian Bioeconomy Institute, in a big effort. And the pre-training data are, of course, unlabeled, so those are just scans. And then there are some test sets that have different names, usually starting with 4, like forest. There's one for instance and semantic segmentation. Then there's one for tree classification. It's a bit of a different setting because the individual trees are segmented. So the point cloud is not just a mess of a piece of forest, but it's exactly what belongs to one tree. And then with the same setup of giving the specific tree, there's also one for regressing the tree age. That one is a bit more restricted, only a small set of data from Scandinavia. You can guess why, because it's just much harder to label that. You need an expert and you need to go to the field or cut it down or whatever, but you need to actually get access to the true age of the tree, which is a lot more work than just saying where's the ground and where's the wood. Okay, and then we put it all together. We built this model. Here you see some results. So the good news, we're getting to very reasonable segmentation performance, so 85% plus with fine-tuning, and still above 80% if one leaves the features completely frozen and just probes them with a single linear classifier. So perfectly usable range, I would say, very high, already very high accuracies. You already see something else, which is that even if we just train that model from scratch without the self-supervised learning, it also does fairly well. So what this says is simply the data collection is, compared to the capacity of the model or the complexity of the problem, so large that one can afford to do fully supervised training. But of course, that's not always a given. So we did this study, this simulation, you see at the top, with only 5% of the data. So that's assuming that your labeled data, the data where you know the correct answers and you can do supervised learning, is a lot less because you are not Stefano and you didn't have the time to collect this for a very long time. So then with that little data, the gap, of course, grows. So the version that does not use self-supervised learning suffers most because its overall data volume is just very small. It doesn't learn as much about the world. Whereas the self-supervised learning has still, without labels, used a huge amount of data, has found a lot more information, has learned a lot more about what the visual world looks like, and then fine-tuning or training the probe with only the small amount of data will obviously still give you good results. So yeah, if you add more and more data, the gap reduces, or in other words, the self-supervised learning, of course, becomes obsolete if you can do supervised learning at the same scale, because the supervision has higher density for sure. Another result which we found very encouraging is there is still potential for scaling up. So our light PT model, the green one, as you see, is really light. So it's actually, even when we double the amount of parameters, it's still faster than PTV3 and a lot faster than the older versions. And it's still not too far away actually from even convolutional models. So it's quick, it's efficient. And that means we can scale up, and we have done that. We've scaled it up to more than 80 million parameters, which for a point cloud model is reasonably large. And again, the good news is there's consistent improvement in any configuration, and for almost any problem, it actually gets better. The not so good news at the moment is the gains at the moment are small. In our view, this is likely still a data limit. So one could make more gains if one had a lot more data than we have at our disposal at the moment. And so there is space for better engineering. Where this ends, where the scaling law ends and this flattens out for point clouds is a completely open question. I think nobody knows that at the moment. Yeah, we also did, of course, the instance segmentation, which is in many ways the more interesting problem for practical forestry. There, with very much data, the gains completely disappear. It's not that it gets much worse, but it also doesn't get much better anymore. The let's say that this is not completely understood yet, but it's something that we actually also share with the imaging world, that when we do this self-supervised training, so the pre-training is done only with data, but without any particular objective, without any supervision, it seems to converge more towards semantics, towards the large-scale objects or regions in the data that have a common semantic meaning, that are the same thing, like all are leaves or all are tree stems, or in images maybe all belong to an animal or all belong to the sky. This sort of coarse semantics seems to be the level that emerges most prominently, whereas the instantiation, so which are the two different trees, which of course both have wood and both have leaves and so on, this one comes out a lot less. So you gain less from the self-supervision at present, and you need more labels to get the problem right, which of course means you get closer to the supervised version and the differences disappear increasingly. The hope to get more instance aware, more object aware, self-supervised learning is alive, but it's an open research program. Here at the bottom, I showed you the three versions just to give those numbers a visual meaning. You know, like an MAP of 60% or so, that sounds like, oh, the problem is average, the problem is half solved. But those numbers are actually treacherous. The measures that we use nowadays just to make sure that we really do clean science and see the significant differences, the metrics are very strict. So at the bottom, you see those examples. Those are actually even the ones with only 20%. So they're below 50% in theory. But if you look at it, the segmentation is very, very decent. And you actually have to look twice to see where's the difference to the ground truth labeling on the right side. So don't be fooled by the numbers. Those metrics are really chosen to be strict. And I think for quite a few applications, we're getting to usable performance. Yeah, then some per tree tasks. This is a bigger stretch. This is a bigger domain gap, I would say, because we're giving it a single tree and not a patch of forest. So it's different from what it has seen during all its pre-training. Still, the things work fairly well. So species classification, you get to accuracies of above 80%. Age regression, there it's hard to say what is a good result. We are doing fairly well, but is 27 years plus minus. You know, the youngest trees, the young trees are only 30 to 50 years. So there you would say it's a huge error. But then there are also trees in the data set with more than 300 years. So then it's actually a pretty good guess. But I mean, RMSEs of 27, which are caused mostly by the large outliers. Most guesses are much better, which you see from the MAE, the mean absolute error, which is below 20 years. And also there is an R-square, so how well do the estimated and the true ages correlate, and the models are getting there. So even for these relatively abstract tasks, because directly looking at the point cloud, you don't see much about the age. You have to think very much around the corner. what species is it, and what dimensions has it got, and what does that tell me about the possible age. Nevertheless, it's actually already doing reasonably well. Of course, there is still potential for improvement. I would never claim this is solved. Okay, with this, I'm at the end of the talk. After having shown a lot of technology, maybe some take-home messages that I hope are the things you remember if you don't remember all the details. I'd like to convey the message that AI type, neural network type analysis methods for point clouds have come a long way since the early how do we do it at all, or PointNet++. We have really made some leeway, and we are at a, in many cases, even practically usable performance levels. Methods are mature. You can take them off the shelf. You can download them from the internet. You can make them work. The bottleneck at the moment is actually training data. Even with all the scan data that overwhelms us in our hard disks, we're far from what the imaging and the language people have, and it shows. So we would still need more data to really learn everything that the world has to show us. While we are not there yet, and my talk very cautiously is called Towards Foundation Models, I feel that foundation models for off-the-shelf use are a real possibility. We're not there yet, but they are not in principle unsolvable. They're not, science fiction. Maybe in 10 years they are here. Maybe in 5 years they're here. I'm sure in 50 years they are here, probably earlier. So these are coming. I'm absolutely convinced we're not that far. One qualification from my talk, foundation model, right? It's a big term. It says the model that can do everything. But you cannot do everything. Doing everything is nothing. You always have to somehow have an application domain, sensors for scanning, data characteristics, everything varies widely. So at the moment, and probably for the foreseeable future, foundational models will remain domain specific. It's not like we will dissolve. Remote sensing will go away and we'll just take standard point cloud models. You have to make them for scans of forests, just like you had to make them for I don't know, CT scans of people's abdomen, or like you have to make them for a specific type of biological molecule. So they're foundational in the sense that they are useful for a class of problems, but that class of problems still needs to be restricted to be useful. And finally, this is just the beginning. If you are interested in this topic, go ahead. There are many, many interesting problems to be solved. And I think the relentless progress will continue for a while. We're on a good track, not me personally, of course, but we as a research community. Okay, so that's it for me. Thank you, and I'm open for questions. And if you ask a question, maybe show your cameras, and it's a bit more personal.
Nice. Thank you for the super interesting talk, Konrad. So yeah, thank you a lot. I sure have some thoughts or questions myself, but I will first ask if in the audience people have questions. Yeah, as already mentioned, you can unmute and maybe enable your camera and ask the question just like that, or you can unmute yourself, or you can write it in the chat and then I will read it. Please. I thought I saw someone that wanted to begin to talk, but maybe I'm wrong. Wait, I'm trying to change the view on my Teams. Okay, I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, maybe I can ask a question. So again, from the remote sensing angle, let's say, did you think about? I'm not an expert in these modalities, let's say, but I know that there's slightly large data sets of remote sensing or repositories of remote sensing data that were taken using LiDAR or laser, for example, with the goal of monitoring canopy height, and that are also used for training models of that that predict canopy height based on other inputs. And I guess those sources kind of come in a point cloud format. And I can also imagine that the entire repository of them is larger or quite large. Larger, I don't know, but it's quite large. Did you consider using those as source or as input data for your pre-training?
So the question is about existing repositories that were made for
yes. Let me.
Which ones? I mean, there's of course a huge amount more of LiDAR data. Much of it is very low resolution because people fly high for the national mapping agencies to cover the whole country, but then you have only a handful of points per square meter, which is adequate for, say, topographic mapping for updating the national maps. But of course, individual trees, when the trees only has 5 or 10 points on it, I think that would really be science fiction. So that there we need more density. Same is often with space-based data. I mean, as you know, we've also been involved in this satellite-based canopy mapping, and JEDI is a great resource, but you cannot learn about the spatial patterns at reasonable scales because one shot of JEDI actually contains more than one tree within the footprint. So you get 0.5 or 0.2 points per tree, and then you don't even have the neighborhood structure, the patterns, because there's a several 100-meter gap until the next shot. So this is one of the cases where I said that I think we still need foundation models to be treated with caution in terms of it as a term, because a drone scan where on a single tree you have 20,000 points, and a JEDI shot where you have a very elaborate waveform covering the entire world homogeneously, but there is one point that contains 3 trees and then there's nothing for half a kilometer. Those modalities are just so different that just because they were both recorded with laser runtime doesn't mean that they're comparable and need the same model.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's a question of what you want to see. Of course, yeah, I was indeed thinking of JEDI, but I forgot the name for a moment.
I mean, for JEDI, for analyzing JEDI, you can make something like a foundation model. I mean, in our now several years old work that was when JEDI was still in experimental state and they were only building up the algorithms for the data products. We actually built a neural network that could worldwide for any JEDI shot extract the canopy height from the raw waveform, and that worked anywhere on Earth. So you could call it a foundation model, but it was actually trained in a supervised manner. So there was no self-supervised training there, but so be it if you have enough. So you can also call that foundational because there is only one Earth, right? We don't need to be more general than that. But I think it's also a good job to do, but it's very different from the point cloud analysis I talked about before.
Okay, thank you for the answer. Maybe, yeah, Munya, you were first.
Yeah, thank you, Konrad. Nice to see you again. Can you hear me well enough?
Very well, yeah.
Sorry, okay, I'm at the Phi-Lab, so there's a bit of noise. It's also about the data sources themselves. So if I understand well, you kind of take these local scans, and do you aggregate them to then make this bigger data set? And in this case, I've seen that you had a bunch in Europe. Would it be... did you explore with completely different regions? So I'm thinking of the Amazon, for example. Have you worked with the Amazon forest in this context? And a second question would be if there is also an exploration here in the forest part to kind of include other type of data. In this case, it would probably not be only point cloud anymore, but with, for example, the biomass mission, and once we start having new or more data, could it be realistic to kind of take these two very valuable data sources and kind of merge them to have something of higher quality?
Okay, I'll first go to the first one. Data There is a little bit of data in that collection from South America, but not from the Amazon. It's further west. There is also a little bit of data from tropical Africa, from Gabon, I think, where there was a big Elvis campaign, as many know. There is something from New Zealand and Australia. But by and large, the current data collection has a very strong European bias with a little bit of Canada sprinkled in and a little bit of the rest. That is unfortunately so, and that is purely opportunistic. If you go around and ask everybody and beg everybody and say, can we have your data, which should have these minimum specifications, will you give it to us for an open benchmark that we dump on the internet? Unfortunately, many people are still hesitant, or they say it's too old, or they say we have nobody to prepare it for you. Stefano has really struggled hard to collect as much as he could in his environment, in his network, in the forestry community. And there is a new version now. There is now actually a version 2 of that data set, which is larger, but it's still somewhat Northern Hemisphere centric and Europe centric, simply because we have more such data. Europe has probably, on average over the countries, the best, most detailed public mapping tradition. And on top of that, also the best open data policies. So that bias is unfortunate, but that's what it is at the moment. And as I said, there are big white spots on the map. There's nothing from Russia, there's nothing from China. So large regions of Asia are missing, unfortunately. We just can't get our hands on it. If you have access to such collections with sufficient coverage and density, I'm the first one to put my hand up. I'll sponsor the discs if you make them public available. But unfortunately, it's not so easy. Data sharing in this realm is not yet as self-evident as in some other areas like computer science. And for the second question, you talked about the basically new modalities. So that would be a sort of that's a next step. That's something that we're starting to see a lot in the imaging and image and language domain, these so-called multimodal foundation models. So they can take in scans, they can take in images, they can maybe even take in radar, they can take in language in extreme cases. In robotics, they are taking in even sensor readings from the actuators and so on. So you try to make this sort of multi-sensory understanding somehow that definitely biological sensing systems are very good at. In remote sensing, we're doing first steps. If you look at modern so-called foundation models, the Prithvi, Smarties, Clay, Terramind, whatever generation, they can actually digest radar, they can digest DMs and so on. So they are doing their best. We're not yet there for forestry, among others, because the data is just too new. I mean, biomass was unavailable until recently, and it would go more towards the imaging modality again, I feel, because the scale, just the GSD of those products and of those sensors is in a range where combining them directly with, say, airborne LiDAR makes no sense. I'm all for multi-sensory and multispectral and whatnot, but bridging 3 orders of magnitude in scale, right? The one point is 3 centimeters and the next point is 300 meters. That doesn't make sense. They simply don't. What they see of the world not only is different, but it has almost no overlap in information. So it would be very hard to get a synergy and not just 2 models living under the same hood, but behaving independently and not talking to each other. I think there should be multimodality should be strengthened. There's no reason why you cannot directly fuse biomass with Sentinel and with ALOS and with MetaInsat even, and I don't know what. But I don't, maybe JEDI, or at least derived products, but I don't see how this could get to the dimensions of airborne or even terrestrial LiDAR just because of the scale difference. So there, I think we're really, the difference between a drone-based close-range laser scan and biomass is in some sense as large as between an image and language, right? So.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks. Very interesting and also very interesting talk. Thank you.
Okay, we have a hand put up by Roberta.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. My question is a little bit a curiosity, because now remote sensing, there is are very popular these embeddings. Also, there is, by the way, as a challenge about them, which are a sort of sub-product of foundational models. And so they release this internal representation that are just vectorized representation of all the data learned during training. So my question is, does it make sense to think to embeddings also for point cloud? I guess there is the limitation also on the training data, and so the real representativeness of this kind of data. But this is just a curiosity. Does it make sense to think also to embeddings and not to have specialized foundation models for point cloud, or maybe we still have to resolve other problems before to think to embeddings?
I think that would make a lot of sense. I mean, in my way of thinking, embeddings make sense. I mean, I'm a fan of them, but embeddings are essentially just the foundation model idea consequently carried through to the end. You say, as I said before, my hope is, the thing I really want to achieve is a foundation model that I can use frozen. I never have to touch it again. It's trained so well that it's a frozen feature extractor. All its parameters work. I just run it in forward inference mode. And then, of course, the logic is, well, if everybody runs it in forward inference mode on the same data, everybody takes the same model, doesn't touch the weights, and runs it on the same Sentinel inputs, why would we do that repeatedly? Let's do it once and for all, compute it through, and save the result of that inference. And that is exactly what embeddings are, right? Embeddings are essentially the output, arguing that you save all the compute and also the space because of the compression, compared to having to work with the raw inputs. But a frozen, if Tessera or Google or whoever give me their backbone and the same input images, I will get the same embeddings. So it's really equivalent to running a frozen foundation model. So this is great. Again, it causes a certain restriction, which may be a problem for you or not, depending on your application. If you want to do stuff that concerns vegetation at a seasonal scale, so crops, biomass, these sort of things, but they are perfect. I mean, I say it, we have experiments, the Google Alpha Earth foundations actually work better than most other foundation models for that, because that's what they are tuned and optimized for. But of course, you are also giving freedom out of hand. If you want to do a special analysis where you have to target something and you would do a change detection where you want to find out when exactly in the year was that event, that embedding might not do the job because it's already sort of averaged and compressed along the year, and it can't pin things down to exact dates, which some simpler model might be able to do. So the embeddings are great, but you're also, of course, limited to using them in the way that was envisaged by the people who do it. They feed in the data. They decided we feed in a whole year and compress it in one embedding, and you are stuck with that. You cannot change that anymore. So that's where the limitation is. I think embeddings have a big role in the future, but we won't have a single set of embeddings for the Earth or even for one modality. We will actually have to have multiple ones because we want different granularities in space, in time, in a spectrum and whatever. And we're not sure that everything's preserved. Because then at some point the embeddings get as large as the raw data, right? But they are a good thing. And for point clouds, yes, I imagine that could be done. If there is a point cloud that multiple people want to use the same point cloud repeatedly and work on it, there's actually a very strong argument for it because it can be compressed stronger. There's more redundancy and more emptiness, and cleverly made embeddings would make the data handling a lot easier. Of course, again, it depends a bit on the application. In imaging, when you do mapping from remote sensing images, the domain of your input and the output is very similar. The images shows a piece of the Earth, and your output should also be a planimetric 2D piece of the Earth, a map usually. So they naturally live in the same representation, right? You do something per pixel. Now in point cloud, that's not always the case. You don't want to do things per point. You actually want to do things per object or per hectare or whatever. So the question is then, should your embeddings live at the point level, or should you abstract so far that out of the point clouds, you create an embedding that is again regular and dense in space so that people can quickly use it for mapping, or regular and dense in volume so that they can use it for 3D mapping or something. So it's much less obvious how to do it because it's not a given that the input and output domain are the same, essentially the surface of the Earth unrolled in 2D plane. But in principle, nothing speaks against pre-computing embeddings, which again is just collect all the point information that you think should go into one base data product, squish it through your foundation model, and store the output. I think that would make a lot of sense if we find an application where enough people want the same embeddings. So essentially the same data treated in similar manner. And the gains in pure computation and storage could be even larger in my view.
Thank you.
Very nice. Maybe because we are a bit over time, one final question if someone has a question. Otherwise, I think we can think about wrapping up. Okay. So then I want to thank you one last time, Konrad, for the super interesting talk and for making the time for this. I hope to see you around Phi-Lab in another time. And to the audience, want to say thank you all for attending, and hope to see you next time for the next Phi talk. Thank you, Cristiano, for organizing.
Thank you to everybody. See you in next time in July.
Thanks very much for having me. Bye-bye. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, Konrad. Bye.
Have a nice afternoon, Konrad, and have a nice afternoon, everyone else. Bye-bye.